So this is an overview of Chapter 2, Social Cognition, and this is just meant to walk you through the objectives for the chapter. So these would be things that you want to make sure that you come away from Chapter 2 understanding and knowing. So first off would be to discuss what is meant by social cognition. What does that term mean? It's the title of the chapter, so it's obviously a very broad category or subcategory of social psychology. You'll want to look to list the basic assumptions that most social psychologists have with respect to cognitive processes. So social psychologists use a lot of cognitive processes in their theories and their ideas as to why people do what they do. And a lot of it is based on cognition, ways that we think, and what drives our thinking, and then how that can relate to our behavior. So there's a few basic assumptions that psychologists have when it comes to social cognition. So you'll want to understand those. State the basic purpose and function of schemas, as well as the three basic processes that they influence. So a schema, you're going to learn, is basically a cognitive shortcut. It's really a way of categorizing things that fall into similar categories. And we do this to sort of compartmentalize ideas, concepts, places, people in our brain. Our brain can hold unlimited amounts of information, but it likes to do so in an organized fashion. So we tend to develop what's called schemas. So you'll want to know how those function and what purpose they serve, and how they influence the basic processes with which our brain operates. Then consider how our schemas may or may not be altered in the face of new information. So once we've established a schema, we have an idea for something, like, pets. What comes to mind, or what kind of animals make good pets? We think of dog, cat, bird, fish, maybe reptiles, okay? We don't typically think of tigers or lions. And so that's a schema. But then how can that schema be altered in the face of new information? What if all of a sudden potbelly pigs make great pets and everybody's into that and it's a new trend? That kind of forces us to alter our schema of what we thought of as a household pet, right? So you'll be digging deeper into what schemas are and how they function. Then discuss how the self-fulfilling prophecy may operate in certain applied settings, such as classroom environments. So you'll learn what is meant by self-fulfilling prophecy. Basically, if we think something enough and we say it enough, we kind of make it come true. So that just shows the power of our thoughts, our cognitions. Explain why we often use heuristics and the consequences of their use. So here's where you're going to need to know the various types of heuristics, and you can contrast two different types. At least, there's several of these, and you'll see actually I put some videos in this week's material that talk about heuristics, specifically the types: availability heuristic, representativeness heuristic, and there's various others. So you'll want to understand what those are. What is a heuristic? How do we use it? Define and give an example of priming. How is this used in social cognition? How can our brain be primed to take in information? And when I say primed, you'll want to understand what that means. How are we primed? By media, by experiences, by the people that we interact with, by the types of information that we are exposed to. How does this prime us for thinking? Discuss the nature of automatic processing versus controlled processing in social thought. So we tend to think in a lot of automatic ways. So a lot of our thinking can happen just automatically. We don't really have to spend too much time processing there. We can come to quick conclusions about people or things or places based on past experiences or based on what we've heard, information that we know. And you know, that can be good, but that can also have drawbacks. And then there's controlled processing, where we actually have to sit down and think about things a little bit more. You know, we might do that like if we are buying a house or deciding what college to go to. Probably not going to be automatic processing. It's going to be a controlled, we do a pro-con list type of thing. So understand how those two operate differently. Examine why we tend to show a negativity bias towards certain people or things, and particularly explain this from an evolutionary or biological perspective. How might negativity bias aid us in our evolutionary kind of cycle? You know, we learned about some of the different perspectives social psychologists take, and one of those is the evolutionary perspective. So how might negativity bias serve us well if you come from that perspective? Consider the prevalence and meanings of the optimistic bias, overconfidence barrier, and planning fallacy. These are all sort of pitfalls of our cognitions. All three of those are different pitfalls, or sometimes they can help you, but they're tools that our brain uses to think and come to conclusions. So understand how each is used, and then the consequences of those types of social thinking. Understand why sometimes our tendency to do a minimal amount of cognitive work might be justified. So here's where, like, cognitive workload, what is cognitive overload, how can that affect us? Next, identify the effects that counterfactual thinking may have on our mood and general well-being. So what is counterfactual thinking? Is it good? Is it bad? How does it affect our mood? How does it affect our well-being? Same thing with magical thinking. What is that? And what kind of principles are involved here when we talk about this pattern of cognition? Explain thought suppression. What does that mean when we say suppress your thoughts? Can you do that? Is it possible? How? Often it's not possible. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. There's pros and cons of whether it can be effective. But so what you're going to want to do is identify some different individual characteristics that are particularly susceptible to negative effects of thought suppression. Okay, so thought suppression can serve us well if the thoughts we're having are not good for us. They don't serve us well, but we can also experience some negative effects of thought suppression. Where might that happen? And who might that happen mostly with? Provide a rationale for why we actually do a fairly good job in processing social information. If you think about it, the social world is enormous. There's so much information hitting us at all times. Auditory, visual information, tactile information. It's coming at us constantly. And so our brain actually does a really good job of taking it all in and checking it away in different, compartments and categories and understanding it. So we'll talk a little bit about, why that's the case. Consider how affect, our mood or feelings, can influence cognition. How do your mood and your feelings and your emotions influence cognition? And you'll do this by discussing mood-dependent memory, mood congruence effects, and the effects of being in a good mood on social behavior. So there's a lot to say for mood. I think recently we're seeing a lot of memes out there about our mood and how it can affect us. I don't think anyone's foreign to this idea that a good mood can affect you and a bad mood can affect you. What does research say about that? How are our memories tied to mood? Particularly when we form those memories and what mood we're in when we form them, that has an effect on us. Mood congruence effects, like when our mood matches our behavior and what we're doing. And then, being in a good mood brings about good things. It brings about good social behavior. And I think that cliche, fake it till you make it, has a lot of actual research packed behind it, because sometimes just being in a good mood affects everyone around us. Even if we don't feel in a good mood, if we can try to be in a good mood, it can actually bring about different circumstances and behaviors in others. And then lastly, list the ways that cognition can influence affect. So how can your thinking influence your mood? So we'll turn from looking at how your mood influences your thinking, and then flipping it to how can thinking influence your mood? Can you put yourself in a good mood just by how you think? And so some of those other elements we've already covered will pop up again and be discussed in relation to that.